office. And he has one question before he brings him into the Dodgers organization and potentially brings him into the major leagues. He wants to see how Jackie Robinson, would respond when he was unpopular and people tried to do things to him, like, slide into the base with their cleats up and things along that, which he fully expected was going to happen because of the hate and the prejudice that was experienced. They didn't want black people to be playing in the major leagues. And so he brings Jackie Robinson into his office, and he says, you're going to have to deal with your temper. He said, when they come at you, and they're going to taunt you, and they're going to insult you, and they're going to try to hurt you, the pitches will come in too close to you, and they're going to hit you with pitches. How are you going to react to that? And he says to Jackie Robinson, you need to calm your temper. And then he kind of brings Jackie up to a fever pitch, and he says, and Jackie just kind of stands up and he says, you want to have a player who doesn't have the guts to fight back? You want to have a player that doesn't have the guts to fight back? And what was that owner's response? He said, no. I want a player who has the guts not to fight back. He said, people are not going to like this. They're going to do anything to get you to react. Echo a curse with a curse, and they will only hear yours. Follow a blow with a blow, and they will blame you. Your enemy will be all out in full force, and you cannot meet him on his own low ground. And then he kind of turns and he says something interesting. Like our Savior, you got to have the guts to turn the other cheek. Like our Savior, you have to have the guts to turn the other cheek. And of course, you know how the story goes. All those things happened to Jackie Robinson when he went to the major leagues. He was taunted. People tried pitchers threw balls right at him. People came in with their cleats right at him and on the bases. There were all kinds of things that happened to him. They were trying to taunt him. He turned the other cheek. He learned to control his temper and not to react. In a nonviolent way, he resisted what was going on. And ultimately, he opened the door for other African Americans to be a part of Major League Baseball and other sports to speak of. By doing what? Taking this simple principle of Jesus, turning the other cheek. It's a fascinating example, I think. So let's take a look at this text a little bit. Jesus always begins in this section, remember, with the old way of looking at things. He looks at what the law said in the Old Testament, and then he goes back to the heart of what it was all about and makes some modifications, some additions, and what he calls the fulfillment of the law. And he says, you have heard it said. He always says something like that, right? And in this case, he says, you have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, or eye for eye and tooth for tooth. Now this was called in Roman law lex talionis, which you probably don't need to know, but nonetheless, what I wanted you to realize is that this was actually a pretty common prescription for when somebody hurt you, when someone injured you. What do you do? In the ancient world, there were basically two options. There was the option of the blood feud, or there was the option of lex talionis. The blood feud meant that you retaliated and you not only got even, you went a step further. And that precipitated more violence, and then you responded again, and then they came back to you again. It's kind of like, that story of the Hatfields and the McCoys that you always hear about down in Appalachia, where they just keep one-upping each other, I'm going to retaliate against you, and then they come back at me, and then I go back at them again, and it never ends. The violence escalates and never ends. That was called the blood feud way of dealing with it. And then there was the code of Hammurabi, and then we find it in the Old Testament as well. This idea of equal remedy for an injury. So here's a couple of them in the Old Testament. Exodus 21:24. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Leviticus 24:20, fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. The one who has inflicted injury must suffer the same injury. In Deuteronomy 19:21, show no pity, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. So a couple things that you see there. First of all, your response to injury is a measured response. You can't just do anything that you wanted to do. It's limited to an equal response. But the other thing about this Old Testament law was that it required you to respond equally. Notice it says, show no pity. It doesn't say, well, you can be merciful to the person if you want to. You can be loving toward the person, gracious if you want to. No, it says, show no pity. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth, foot for foot, whatever it is, equal retribution, equal revenge. You don't go beyond it, but that's what the standard was. The lex talionis, it was called. So you had those were basically the two options that were out there. And in the Old Testament, we find that this is firmly embedded in the law, that there was a measured and equal response that was, you were restricted to that. Now, what does Jesus do here? Jesus, in fulfilling this thing, remember the foundation of all of Jesus as he fulfills the law, is he takes it back to loving God and loving one's neighbor. He reminds us in the context that we're called to be merciful, peacemakers, and he says you're going to be blessed if you're somebody who's persecuted, and there's all kinds of these things that Jesus has to say in this context. But under Jesus, meekness and peacemaking are rewarded in the kingdom. And love of God and neighbor, and we're going to see even our enemies in the next text we'll look at next week, must modify our response in Christ's kingdom. Jesus' kingdom turns things upside down, and such is the case here. We have to go deeper than, well, if you gouge out my eye, I'm going to gouge out your eye. And if you cut off my toe, I'm going to cut off your toe. Just that retaliation way of looking at things. Instead of a no-pity approach, which was a part of that Old Testament law, he says, now we're people of grace, we're people of mercy, we're people of forgiveness, we're people of love. And we follow a way of humility and peacemaking. And all of that's incorporated into this whole section that we call the Sermon on the Mount. Johnny Appleseed did not see this. That's funny. But Jesus overtly ends the Mosaic command to show no pity in the appropriation of lex talionis, and in its place orders his followers to be merciful. I guarantee that was not Johnny Appleseed who said that. So anyway, that was a commentator whose name was not Johnny Appleseed. But you get the point, right? Don't you just love spell check? I don't know. It's so funny. The point is pretty clear. Jesus says, that was better than what people had. It at least limited their response. But he says, I'm calling you to something deeper here. I'm calling you to love your enemies and your neighbors. I'm calling you to love other people and be merciful. And yes, it's okay to show pity. In fact, to show mercy and grace is a positive and a good thing in my kingdom. We got to turn the world upside down by the way we react to personal injury and requests for things, as we'll see later on in this text. So, Jesus kind of turns things upside down. Now, how does he do that? By basically suggesting to us that we need to surprise our opponent with an initiative that's going to show the true nature of their heart. He tells us, first of all, we need to turn the other cheek. We need to turn the other cheek. He says in verse 39, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. Now remember that this was written to the people who Jesus calls the fortunate ones. The blessed are the poor in spirit, the meek, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, those kind of people, those who are peacemakers, those who are even the persecuted. Those on the margins, the powerless, the poor, the ones dealing with issues of injustice, those beaten and broken up by life, those called to be peacemakers in a context of anticipated persecution. And I think we need to remember that when we're looking at this text, because it's not an easy text. When Jesus gave this teaching, it was not an easy text. And consider it in the first century world, where Christians were largely a persecuted minority, and the Romans didn't like them very much. We have in church history all kinds of examples of Christians who were forced into the lion's den of the Colosseum, and who were forced to fight each other, or were forced against wild animals and things. They did some horrible things to Christians. So these are not easy teachings, even back in the day, let alone in our own. How do we handle this, Jesus? Shouldn't we fight back? Shouldn't we counterpunch somebody who comes at us? If they insult us, should we not insult back? If they hit us, should we not hit them back? Is that not human nature? Is that not the way of the world? And Jesus said, if someone slaps you on one cheek, turn to him the other cheek. What do we do with that? The surprising way of escape. Do not resist an evil person. Or one translation says, don't use violence to resist evil. Or Scott McKnight says it could be translated even as a positive action of love as much as a negative posture. It could be translated something like, be ready for an act of grace. Be ready to show somebody a surprising act of grace that goes beyond anything that they would ever expect or deserve. It's very different than the whole retaliation and measure that we saw in the Old Testament. Paul has a parallel. He says in Romans 12:19, do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it's written, it is mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Very different concept, isn't it? Grace, mercy, forgiveness, love, these concepts are brought into the equation. That when I'm tempted to retaliate, when I'm tempted toward revenge, what should I do? He says, leave it to God. God will take care of it. He ultimately will handle it in the judgment. One day he'll take care of it, he'll make it all right, and he's the one who's the perfect judge, he'll do it right. He'll do it exactly right. So leave it to him, and then do these surprising things. Overcome evil by doing good things to someone who's trying to do evil to you. It's an interesting principle, isn't it? And harder to do in life than it is. I mean, it sounds good on paper, but when it comes to the nitty-gritty of life, it's not always an easy thing to do, is it? To go a step further, to go the extra mile, to turn the other cheek. These are not simple things. Now, a couple things about turning the other cheek. In its context, what this would mean is the first slap would be from the right hand of the person, and they would slap you on the cheek with an open palm. You wouldn't use your left hand to slap. That was just culturally not the way you did things. If you've ever traveled around the world, you'll know that there are some cultures where people just don't use their left hands for public things. Okay, they had their own uses, and I won't go further. But this was true in the Middle East, in that world. They would slap you with the right hand. And then you would turn your cheek. What would happen? They would have to slap you with the back of that hand. This would be a backhanded slap, the second one. And actually, this is not so much a violent act, although it is. It's an insult. In their day, the way they would look at this is, if this person is absolutely dishonoring and shaming me by hitting with the back of their hand. So it was more than just that it hurt. It was also that person is making fun of me. they're insulting me. They're shaming me by what they're doing in this thing. So what Jesus is calling them to is really quite astounding, even more than we might realize in our context. We just think, oh, well, he's going to hit me on that side, so I'll let him hit me on that side. But in reality, there's more to it than just that. It's also retaliating. It's refraining from retaliating back to the insult. So it's more of an insult than the open-handed slap would be. So the issue is more than just about returning insult for insult. It's more than just returning violence for violence. It's both. It's both. When somebody insults me, what do? I don't insult them back. If somebody hits me, slaps me, or whatever, dishonors me, do I retaliate and say in the same way? Jesus is saying no. Don't do that. So to turn the other cheek is not simply to put up with the insult. It's to turn the cheek of equal dignity. Glenn Stosson says it this way. It may, of course, lead to a second slap, or it may surprise the arrogant person into realizing that you have an unexpected kind of dignity. It's like the followers of Martin Luther King Jr., who did not retaliate against the segregationist racists, but marched nonviolently in the face of stones, police dogs, beatings, and fire hoses. This shocked the world into a new kind of awareness of the injustice and a new kind of respect for the self-discipline of the nonviolent protest. It's fascinating. Some of you will remember this better than I do, but in the civil rights marches where the things happened, one of the things that turned the tide and brought the civil rights movement around was when it began to be televised. For example, they just celebrated, 50 years at Selma, at the bridge, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where so many were beaten and hurt, and just some atrocities went on there. As that began to be televised and put in papers, people began to just realize the horror and the shame of what was taking place. Sometimes when we don't react, or we don't react in violence, but instead we just keep our mouth shut when we're quiet, it opens up the door for people to realize the injustice of the situation. So it's one of the questions that sometimes is raised about in all of this discussion is, should we just sit back and watch injustice? You know, if I see somebody that's being hurt, or somebody who's being taken advantage of, should I do something about it? Is Jesus saying I should just ignore it? Well, he's talking about your personal thing, first of all. And clearly, if you can do something to stop injustice being done, or violence being done, or insult being done of another person, I would say you would be completely in Jesus' way of thinking that would be something you ought to do. Injustice is clearly something that God is concerned about. If you've ever read the Old Testament, and it's unfortunately so many of us don't, but if you read the prophets, one of the things you'll see over and over again is how concerned God is about injustice, about the poor and marginalized peoples of this world. And he wants his people to stand up and do something about it. So that's not the point. The point isn't that we should just allow injustice to take place. We should stand up. We should talk about it. We should say something. We should stop it when we can do something about it. But there is something here about being a humble servant. There is something about a surprising initiative of not striking back at another person that can have a powerful effect. I don't think Jesus is calling us to be doormats who take this to an extreme, okay? But it is something that is a principle that we need to take seriously. There was an article by Matt Perman in Desiring God Ministries with John Piper, and he said this: first, we need to clarify what the problem is not. The problem is not that Jesus appears to be telling us to lie down and let evil overtake us. That's clearly not what he's saying. Instead, telling us what it looks like not to be overcome by evil, but to overcome evil with good. We've all seen the wisdom of Jesus' words here in our everyday lives. Much of the time, the most effective way to overcome evil is by not resisting it. If someone says a mean word, it is far more effective to respond with kindness than with another mean word in return. If someone tries wrongly to cut you off on the freeway, it's usually best just to let them do it. If we would learn these principles, our lives would be much more peaceful, and we would be vindicated more often. Jesus is using hyperbole to illustrate what our primary disposition and attitude should be. Not to say that we should literally give in to every attempt to do evil against us. There has to be some wisdom in all of this. There are some places we might find ourselves where we are in danger and where we don't have to stand there and take it. We can run away or we can do something. I don't know that Jesus is saying in every case we have to take all the violence that's pushed toward us. But he is saying something about defusing the situation by not responding to an insult, by not responding to the violence with other violence. That often diffuses the situation and keeps it from escalating to something greater. And I think we see that general principle and we understand that. Having said that, however, there are times where turning the other cheek has some serious consequences. And let's think about the example of Jesus for a minute. He's the one who gave us the teaching. Isaiah 50 is the servant song. And in it, there's some fascinating things that the scriptures apply to Jesus. They were prophetic words. But notice what Isaiah 50 says in verse 6. Speaking of Jesus here, I offered my back to those who beat me, my cheeks to those who pulled out my beard. I did not hide my face from mocking and spitting. Because the sovereign Lord helps me, I will not be disgraced. Therefore I have set my face like flint, and I know I will not be put to shame. He who vindicates me is near. Who then shall bring charges against me? Let us face each other. Who is my accuser? Let him confront me. Fascinating picture of Jesus. It says, I allowed them to pluck the beard. They were mocking me. They were insulting me. I allowed them that. And it's true, isn't it? We see that in the crucifixion and what Jesus does there. Instead of resisting, he willingly goes along with what happens there. So Jesus stands as our servant example, okay? And there are times when following Jesus will cost us something, where it's about sacrifice, and we need to recognize that. But I do think we can also use some common sense here in interpreting what Jesus is saying. Usually the best thing we can do is defuse the situation by refusing to respond. Let's keep going. You see another one. He gives 4 examples here, but they're all kind of tied together. Here's an interesting one. He says, if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. Somebody wants to sue you and he wants to take the shirt off your back. You give him your coat too. What is this talking about here? Now, interestingly, again, Jesus is using he has some shock value in what he's trying to say here. In the cultural context, a person suing you cannot sue for your coat. Okay? Your outer garment or your tunic, depending on what translation you're talking about. Basically, what they were wearing, they had, of course, the loin cloth or their underwear, if you will. And then they had kind of a long shirt, and then they had the coat that went over the top of it. And it was against the Jewish law, actually, to take someone's coat or try to hold it overnight. I mean, you could accept it as for a period of time, but you had to give it back at nighttime. Because otherwise the person might freeze to death. I mean, it might get cold. So it was against the law, literally, to give them the coat. And so Exodus 22:26. If you take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, return it by sunset, because that cloak is the only covering your neighbor has. What else can they sleep in? When they cry out to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate. And Deuteronomy 24:12, if the neighbor is poor, do not go to sleep with the pledge in your possession. Return their cloak by sunset so that your neighbor may sleep in it. Then they will thank you, and it will be regarded as a righteous act in the sight of the Lord your God. So Jesus here is suggesting another shocking, transforming initiative. Take off your coat and your shirt and give them both to the greedy person who's suing you in court, while you stand naked, basically, in the court. In Jesus' culture, that would be enormously embarrassing, but it would reveal the plaintiff's greed in all of its nakedness. Isn't that interesting? It would. Okay, you want that? Well, I'll give you the rest of my clothes too. And you stand there in the court. That person's motive is revealed. Isn't it fascinating? Sometimes these surprising initiatives have an effect that goes beyond what we normally think. We are showing grace in one sense, but we're also providing for an opportunity for our injustice to be seen in all of its nakedness, if you will. Interestingly, Jesus, when he was crucified, Matthew 27:35, when they crucified him, they divided up his clothes by casting lots. He knows something of that kind of shame, even if it's a slightly different situation. The third of the examples is the extra mile. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles, Jesus says. If somebody forces you to go 1 mile, then go 2 instead. Go the extra mile. Do something beyond what the person's expecting. Do it willingly, of your own accord. Take it an extra step. Show them grace and mercy that they aren't expecting, and see what happens. The social context was that in that day, Roman soldiers had the legal right to requisition occupied people into compulsory work to aid the Roman military. And literally in Roman law, you could force them to carry your stuff for 1 mile. The zealots, you know, the people like Simon the Zealot, who was one of Jesus', there was a whole group of people that were the extremists of the day. They were kind of the terrorist types. They wanted to do violence against Rome. Well, the zealots, they just hated this law. And they did everything to resist it. And they complained about it numerous in the literature of the day. And the zealots thought that one of the ways that they could fight against the Romans was by refusing to carry stuff for the 1 mile. And so Jesus says, no, I got a different way of dealing with it. That if a Roman soldier comes along and says, you carry my stuff for 1 mile, you do 2. Nobody wants to do that. Nobody expects that. The Roman soldier is going to be amazed. What do you want to do that for? You don't have to do this. You only have to do 1 mile. I like this, again, Glenn Stoss said, in neither case does Jesus say, do what he's forcing you to do, comply with oppression, live with powerless resentment. So he's not saying just do it and do it with resentment. Instead, Jesus teaches us to do something of our own initiative, under our own power, something we're not forced to do, something surprising that is in itself a form of resistance. It's a non-violent initiative that confronts the injustice. It shifts from resentful powerlessness to the power of our own surprising initiative, which calls out our adversary to a new level of consciousness of what he or she is doing. Imagine you are a Roman soldier. You've said, come carry my stuff for 1 mile, and you're still going. It's 1.5 miles. And you're talking to this guy along the whole way, and you keep going. You just keep going. I'm going to take this 2 miles. That's going to open up a conversation, I guarantee you. And you're going to be able to share something about, oh, I'm doing this because I'm a follower of Jesus. I know I don't have to, but I want to go the extra mile. I want to treat you better than, you wouldn't say that. I'm going to treat you better than you deserve, but you might you might say, I'm going to go above and beyond what you expect. You can imagine what an effect those kinds of actions can have in the lives of people. Even in our own lives, it may not be helping soldiers out on the road, but when you do a job for someone and you go beyond what they expect, you do something extra, it has an impact. It has an impact. And so it is. Jesus calls us to that. Go the second mile, he says. And he has one last example. He says, give to needy people. He says, give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Now, the situation here would be most likely some sort of a beggar, in most cases, who is looking for a handout. And what would most people do? Jesus said, don't look the other way, right? We see somebody in need. The tendency is always to walk on the other side of the road. Remember the Good Samaritan story? Walk on the other side, try not to notice it. When I lived in LA, and I have to admit, there were times where I'd go for a walk and be walking on the streets, and on most every major corner, you have someone begging for a handout. And, what do you do? The tendency is to not look at the person, to avoid eye contact, and to walk faster. Okay, my wife always gives me a hard time, why do you always walk faster when we go past these people? And, well, I don't know, it just seemed like the natural reaction to it. And it is. And I remember our church used to go down had a ministry on Skid Row, where there are just, tens of thousands of people that are homeless. Just incredible, the situation. And we would feed them hot food. It was good stuff. And there was one lady who was known for giving them all a big hug. She would just give them a big hug as they came through the line. And everybody looked forward to Sunday when they come to 6th and Gladys. And they'd get that hot meal and a hug. And I remember talking to some of those people, and one of the things that they would say is, one of the reasons we like to come here is because you guys will look at us and talk to us and interact with us. He said, you don't know what it's like to have people always avoiding your gaze, always looking away, always trying to just look past you as if you're not there. When we encounter those who really are in need, Jesus says, we ought to do something. We ought to give something to the one, not looking for any return here, but we ought to do something to meet the need. Jesus urges his followers to give those beggars who ask for something, and there's no indication here of exacting payment back or even at interest. So what's happening here is sometimes people, well, I'll give them some money and expect something in return from it. And that isn't what Jesus is talking about here. Here he's saying, let's do what we can to meet the need. I know it raises all kinds of questions in your mind. It's like, and I get it. We see people who are professionals. I've had people literally quote me these verses who've come to churches I've served in the past, who are professional con men. They would go from church to church, and if you didn't give them a handout, they would say, what Jesus said. If anybody comes and begs for something, you have to give him. And he'd quote the verse, chapter, he knew it. He knew it backwards and forwards, because that man was using and abusing the system. I don't think Jesus had that in mind. I don't think that what we're talking about here is, sometimes we become enablers to a problem, and I get that. And I think Jesus recognizes that too. But when there's someone who's legitimately in need and we can do something about the need, I think that's really what Jesus has in mind here. We go the extra mile, we take it an extra step. Yes, that person may not deserve it and he may not get it back again, but I can be light-handed with the things I've been given because I'm a steward of God. And it's no problem for me to give to that person. It's just not a problem. I leave it in God's hands. He's going to make it right in the end. There's a lot of times in my life where I've given something to someone and thought, well, there that goes. And I just leave it in God's hands. So again, these questions require wisdom. Okay? I get that. The application of these principles requires some common sense and some wisdom. But it does say something about Jesus' call to his disciples to say, if you see somebody who's really in need and you come along, don't look away from the need. Try to do something about it. Now, ideally, try to do something that will really help the situation. When it comes to those, beggars on the side of the road with the signs, one of the best responses I know somebody who prepares little plastic bags with like a toothbrush and toothpaste and basic things like that, and hands those out every time they go past those. And people appreciate it. It's a simple little way that people can apply the thing. Sometimes money gets used for things you maybe didn't want it to be used for, but sometimes there are little simple things that we can do to try to minister to people's needs. And I think corporately, as a church community and in this community, these bigger issues of people who are homeless and who are in need, these are things we have to wrestle with in light of what Jesus has to say here, I think. And we can't too easily just skirt by saying, well, they're abusing the system. I think there are some legitimate issues where Christians need to take those things seriously. That, of course, is an issue that's much bigger and broader than what we can deal with in one sermon. But I guess let's kind of narrow this down to a couple of principles and apply it to our lives. When it comes to personal injury, the follower of Jesus is not to look for revenge or retaliation. Jesus has clearly made some modifications here in his fulfillment. These are better left for God. If someone hurts you, whether through insult or whatever way, what do you do with it? Leave it with the Lord. Take it to the cross and leave it there. Obviously, there are times where there's issues of personal safety and where common sense and good wisdom comes in. But when it comes to personal injury, the first principle, the general characteristic of our lives, is not to be looking for revenge or retaliation. Love, grace, mercy, forgiveness, and peacemaking are central to our response, not getting even. Servanthood and sacrifice are the way of Jesus. And surprising, peaceful initiatives, and I don't think they have to be these four things. I think we can be creative to come up with other surprising things that will show grace and mercy in a situation, or that will point out someone's true motivation. There are some things that we can do that might go beyond just these things, like turning the other cheek and going the extra mile, or giving a handout. But surprising, peaceful initiatives often bring powerful results. And again, the examples of the civil rights movement in our own country. It's amazing how nonviolent acts can be powerful in raising awareness of an issue. These same principles underlie other movements, People's Power in the Philippines against the dictatorship. And people stood in the streets. And we've seen it in other movements where powerless people just stood up and peacefully let their voice be heard, magnifying the injustice that was going on. There's something about turning the other cheek, about going the extra mile, about doing these things that often grabs people's attention and demonstrates grace in a situation where it's least expected. The followers of Jesus is gracious and generous, even sacrificial in meeting the needs of other people. I don't know that we can meet every need, and we shouldn't be irresponsible in our finances, where we're always, I'm giving handouts to everybody and I'm not paying my own bills. There's, again, common sense and wisdom rule in these. These are principles of life. But nonetheless, we're stewards of what we've been given, and we ought to be gracious and generous, even sacrificial in meeting the needs of others in love. And understand that God watches over the whole thing. He's going to make all things right someday. He will. Leave the revenge, leave the retaliation to Him. Your duty is to love, to show mercy, to forgive, to go the extra mile, to turn the other cheek. I want to read a little story for you real quick. This is a story of a guy from Australia, I believe. His name was Jared McKenna. And it's a little more extended than what I would normally do, but I love this story. He says, I was 18. It was my first year in university. I was studying fine arts. I was coming back on the train, and I'd been reading Martin Luther King Jr. for the first time. I got off at the Warwick train station, and I was walking over the overpass bridge away from the train station. And a typical ADD, dreamland state. I thought of Dr. King's talk of nonviolent resistance, and I hardly even noticed the big guy in a dark tracksuit with sleeves rolled up walking toward me. And still a couple of meters off, he loudly grunted something at me. I missed what he said. A little shocked to have my dream world interrupted, I quickly tried to piece together what he'd said. I definitely heard the word money. Thinking that he had asked for a few bucks to catch the train, I got my wallet out. Bad move. Lunging at me with his fist clenched, and his other hand reaching for something in his pocket, he yelled, "Give me your money." He actually said a sentence along these lines with words that you can't say in front of your mom in the mix. At this point, a number of things went through my head. A number of things flashed through my head years later. He talks about his first thing he was thinking about was fleeing the situation, and the second, he wanted to fight. And he says, I joke about it now, but there was nothing funny at the time. If you've ever been mugged or held up or threatened violently, you know the shock could be numbing. What next flashed through my head short-circuited my panic and crazy split-second plan of split or hit. The words of Jesus that Martin Luther King Jr. had been experimenting with. You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth, but I tell you. And the flash of those words in my imagination felt like warm oil over my head with a tangible sense of this is how God had related to me. For the first time in the situation, I felt grounded. I had already gotten out my wallet, and so I reached in and gave him what I had, which was only $10. You'd think he'd have known better than to choose a student as his victim. I'm still not sure why, but I didn't simply hand over the money. I stuck out my hand and said, I'm Jared. Wide-eyed and with his mouth wide open, he grabbed my hand and grunted, James. Surprised and confused, I said, no, Jared. To which, with the surprise to match mine, he said, no, I'm James. Okay, I said. There was this awkward pause. This was by far the weirdest passing of the peace that I'd ever been involved with. And I noticed his arm. It was bruised all along it, interrupted only by the scarring that rivaled a pincushion. James' arm was offered to me like an icon in an Orthodox worship service, to contemplate the depth of his pain and all the desperate attempts to escape it. He couldn't have been more than a couple of years older than me. The next thing that hit me was the stench, like stale urine mixed with cigarettes. And as we stood on the bridge, suspended above the freeway, James launched into his life story at a pace to rival the cars passing below. His words seemed to overtake each other, then cut each other off. He said he was sorry to be doing this to me, that he was in a bad way. He'd been doing really well, he was trying to get off the drugs, and his mom had kicked him out of the house again, and now he was back on the streets. And I asked him to come to my house and to eat and have a shower, to get a change of clothes. I'd try to find a new place for him to stay, I told him. Another awkward pause. Then through the middle of us both, on the bridge, darted a young woman in another black tracksuit with a bag under her arm, yelling, Go, go, we gotta go. At that time I didn't know if she'd been hassled by security guards at the train station or if she'd stolen the bag, but it was clear that she knew James and she wanted to get out of there fast. Wait, James, before you go, I shuffled in my backpack, and he grabbed his Bible, his New Testament that he had in his backpack. He gives him the New Testament, and he says, I've got It's got my name and phone number in it if you ever change your mind about a place to stay. For the first time since I was staring at this big guy's fist, it got ugly again. James got right up in my face, and he started to yell, "What do I want a Bible for? I'm going to hell." His face contorted with an anger that had an intensity that explained his arm. Without even thinking, I found myself saying, "James, we're all going to hell. That's why Jesus came." Now, I know that statement rates low on the theological wow scale, and maybe embarrassingly high on the theological cringe factor, but it's what I said. What happened next, I think, was one of the weirdest experiences of my life. This big guy, who only moments earlier was ready to beat me up, if not worse, just started crying, like a little kid does. And suddenly this pain that was so visible in his anger, on his scarred arms and in his situation, seemed to burn like a floodgate at the news of God's love for him. As this big guy stood there crying, I honestly didn't know what to do. In the same way that my response had put him off balance, James's tears now totally threw me. I just stood there while his head hung, his shoulder heaved, and he wept. James didn't say anything more to me. He snorted to try to stop the snot and tears, and then he grabbed the Bible and he started running. After a few paces, he turned, looked at me in the eye, and waved the Bible at me and nodded. And then he kept running. I stood a long moment on the bridge, stunned. Then I picked up my bag, a bit dazed, and continued along the overpass. As I neared the end of the bridge, I saw his female accomplice jump into an already crowded, beaten-up car. And as she got in, she yelled over the music to the others, "I got a bag!" And James ran up, and he got in the car, and he yelled over the music, "I got a Bible?" They piled in and drove off, and I walked right past my bus stop. I just kept walking. James taught me that there is nothing that shows the world what God is like more clearly than when we love our enemies. Despite the reality that throughout the New Testament, the cross is not only how God can save us, it is how we can witness to that salvation. I'm aware that enemy love still scandalizes many a fundamentalist and liberal alike. Who wants a Savior who loves the enemies we want to kill? Who wants to witness to the God whose love falls like rain on the just and the unjust alike? Who wants a God who longs to heal those who have hurt us so that they hurt no more? Who wants a Christ who comes to us in the pain we want to run from? Sometimes turning the other cheek, or "I am Jared," is the surprising initiative that opens up the wounds and allows the life story to come out. And it allows us maybe even to point them to Jesus. It's a tough medicine, isn't it? Turn the other cheek, go the extra mile. Take the shirt off my back as well as my coat. Okay, here's a handout. But Jesus seems to say that my followers go beyond revenge and retaliation to demonstrating my love and my grace through surprising initiatives just like that. Let's pray.